thank you all for coming. I really appreciate having some friendly faces in the crowd today. I'm not the most comfortable public speaker, so I appreciate the moral support. Thank you so much to Ilse and Ruthie for inviting me to speak and for promoting my book. Thank you also to the two co-authors who couldn't make it today, Stacey and Molly. Well, like most of us, we've all turned into hermits in the last couple of years, and Stacey and Molly decided to stay in their own necks of the woods and let me do the talking. So I wanted to just give a sort of overview of what I'll do today, I guess. Instead of doing a reading from the book, I'm just going to pick out a selection of the stories and talk about them, and then I'll leave lots of time for questions at the back end. So I guess I'll just start by saying that every Canadian family has a war story. And often what people think about when they think about their family's war story is a great uncle or grandfather, somebody who served in the military. And what we really wanted to do with this book was to look at the women's stories, what were the women doing in the family. And so we developed a number of exhibitions that were on display at the Canadian Museum of History and the Canadian War Museum, and now we've written this book. So because we're museum people, the book centers on objects, and the exhibitions were all about the material culture of wartime experiences. So for each of the stories that we feature, we look at one woman and a thing that she owned or used that is a way of illustrating a topic about the wartime. So the material culture is sort of our way into the subject matter. So rather than being any kind of exhaustive academic history, the book is more a series of biographical sketches of people with their associated things. So I'll just figure out how to make this go. There we go. So we used the things as our starting point. The exhibitions used artifacts and archival material from the Canadian War Museum and the Canadian Museum of History almost exclusively, but because we had more time and more space and we didn't have to pay for enormously expensive loans, we were free to go out into the country and look at different museum collections. So we have in the book exhibition or objects from BC all the way through to Nova Scotia, which is pretty great. Each of the biographical sketches uses one museum artifact to look into one woman's particular experience, but then also uses the artifact to look at sort of broader social phenomena that were happening during the two wars, and helps to put her life into a broader context. So for instance, this portrait is of Blanche Lavallee. She was a First World War nursing sister from Montreal. And we spend time talking about her personal experience as a military nurse, but then we also dive into the uniform and what the uniform meant to the Canadian population about the First World War. They saw these women as demure, angelic figures swooping into the battlefield to save men from these horrible conditions. But in fact, when you looked at these women's individual experiences, they were quite often muddy and bloody and quite awful. Here she is again in a much more true-to-life portrait. She actually, when she was serving in France, lost over 50 pounds from malnutrition and exhaustion, and eventually she had to be sent home to convalesce. So the uniform was a way for us to, and the portrait of her in her bluebird uniform was a way for us to get into that sort of social expectation of what these women were like, and then to look at the lived reality and how it was different. The next section, I hope you can see it, it's a little bright, but is a wall hanging. Joanna St. Clair was a woman from Moose Jaw. She worked for over a decade to produce a quilt that was full of hundreds and hundreds, I think somewhere in the vicinity of 800 signatures. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom, you can see that she signs it. She says, Joanna St. Clair, her bit for the war effort. So this piece really struck me because it's It's larger than a king-size sheet. It's 10 by 10. It's huge, and it took her over a decade to make. And so you can imagine the amount of dedication and devotion and belief that her cause was the right cause, that it took her all that time to make. The way the signature quilts worked was that people would sponsor the sewer, I guess kind of like the Wakefield signature quilt actually. They would sponsor the sewer to put their family name or their club or somebody who had been lost in the war on the quilt, and then that money was donated. And then she also donated the whole finished product to the Legion when she was done. So there are 46 women in the book. We had a really hard time just having 46. Anybody who's written anything knows that there's probably an equal number of pages on the floor as there are in the actual book, and that was the case also for this product. We had to group the biographical sketches into sections so that they were thematically linked, so it wasn't too disjointed. So we looked at paid civilian work, military service, and volunteering. And during the two wars, women had many new opportunities in those areas, but we also wanted to talk about what we felt was a universal experience, worry and loss. So there's a section about grief and anxiety, which were probably the most common experiences of the world wars. So each of the stories we chose illustrates one of those main themes, but then we also were able to look at other sort of subtopics that didn't make it as organizing themes for the book. So, for example, this woman, Lance Corporal Mary Weaver, we look at women in paramilitary organizations. So before the government opened military service to women, women were all over the country organizing themselves, doing training drills, making their own uniforms, trying to push the government to have women's branches of the military. So that was the case for this uniform, which is actually handmade, not standard issue. The other thing that we looked at with her story was the story of the baby boom. So many people got married quickly and had babies that actually the baby boom starts right near the beginning of the Second World War, which is not something that we necessarily think of. So that was kind of interesting. Her experience was that she was left behind with a new baby in BC when her husband joined the military. And she moved back to Hamilton to have family support. And so she joined the Women's Auxiliary in Hamilton, and that's her uniform. Because we were trying to stick with a one named woman and her related object kind of framework, we had a hard time sometimes. There were all sorts of topics that we knew were important, but that we had a bit of a hard time getting that sort of combination. So we also included in the book these spotlights on objects. So here I chose to show there's an aluminum muffin tin. This woman had saved it from the scrap heap. The scrap drive is where they were promoting, recycling all of your paper, bringing us your old pots and pans, your kettles, all these things that they could turn into jeeps and tanks and shell casings. But that was the one that she saved in her kitchen and then later donated to the museum. The second piece is a pamphlet all about VD, and so we'd use that to talk about military women and sexuality and how their sexuality was regulated while they were in the services. And the last piece is a service flag, which shows the link between patriotism and wartime grief. Instead of promoting women dressing in black mourning clothing, which was the tradition right up until the middle of the First World War, all these patriotic organizations decided that there were too many women in black in Britain and in Canada, across the world really. And so they wanted women to show their grief in a more patriotic fashion. So they promoted the sale of these service flags that people were supposed to hang in their window. If your serving member of the military was killed, you would overlay a color. So you would paint or embroider the maple leaf to be gold, and then people would know that you had lost someone. So the first chapter of the book is all about military service. We look at the First World War, the military nursing sisters, and then the 3 military service branches for women in the Second World War. And unsurprisingly, given the War Museum's amazing collections, we had tons of great stories to choose from. Minnie Gray is the woman who's closest to me. She was originally from Nova Scotia. Her parents were killed when she was very young, and so she was raised in orphanages and a series of foster homes. She winds up in Wolfville right before the war. And she's Black, and she had to navigate a world that was steeped in systemic racism. She tries several times to join the military and eventually is successful, and she trains as a medical orderly. Black women and Black men at that period weren't officially barred from joining the services, but there was still a lot of discrimination. The other thing that was different about her service compared to most service women was that she was sent overseas. Most service women could expect to be a typist or work in a garage or do this kind of support work in Canada, and then only a very few women got sent overseas. But because she was a medical aide, she was able to go overseas with a group of women who were the Canadian Women's Army Corps Pipe Band. And they basically were sent overseas in 1945, just as the war is ending, to entertain the troops who were all busy getting bored, being stuck in Europe, waiting for the ships to bring them back to Canada. So they desperately needed something for all the men to do. So this pipe band traveled around Europe, and they became these celebrities. They were featured in Hollywood magazines and stuff like that. So she had a pretty awesome experience, and her diaries and letters and things are just full of all the excitement and the wonderful experiences that they had. So this is from her basic training album before she goes overseas. After her discharge, Minnie Gray used the skills that she had earned in the Army and probably some of the veterans' benefits that she got to take a nursing attendance course, which meant that she didn't have to go back to domestic service, which is what she had done before the war. For Black women, that was one of the only jobs that was available in the pre-war period. So objectively, Minnie Gray had a good war. She traveled, she got training, and she was able to leave the military in a better condition than she had joined it. Her diaries and letters and photo albums illustrate her enjoyment of the experience and her regret when the war was over. Chapter 2 of the book is all about volunteering. This is one of my favorite sections because it's an under-recognized and undervalued aspect of the war years. Women and men, children, all the people who weren't eligible to work in the military were busy volunteering on the home front. They volunteered for a whole host of wartime causes, often alongside other commitments like paid work and looking after home and family. We included a story, actually several stories about knitting. Knitting now today for pleasure feels very far away from what they were doing during the First World War, but basically when the First World War started and trench warfare became the way that the war was being fought, wet feet could make the difference between a healthy soldier and a soldier that had to be sent home. So dry socks were of massive importance, and the supply chain couldn't support that kind of massive bubble. And so they turned to women and encouraged women right from the Archbishop of Canterbury allowed women to knit in church, and they knew that it was of primary importance to supporting the war effort. One story that I find rather timely is the story of Tsuna Yamashita. She's the third woman from the left on the bottom. She was a Japanese-Canadian woman who lived in Vancouver. And during the Spanish flu pandemic at the end of the First World War, she volunteered in a special flu hospital that was set up specifically to take care of Japanese Canadians. In 1958, she entered an essay contest that was sponsored by the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association, and she talks about her experience of living through a global pandemic and caring for the sick and the dying. This is in the collections at the Library and Archives Canada, the whole essay contest, all the entrance essays are there, which is really amazing. And Tabe's granddaughter, who's a scientist in Deep River, paid to have it translated recently, and so it became a source that we could use for those of us who don't speak Japanese. So that's pretty amazing. So Tabe got the flu. She and her husband and her 4-year-old daughter all got sick, but everyone survived in their family, thankfully. The flu is really interesting, I think, not just because of COVID, but because most of the time before COVID, we would have said that we remembered the First World War, but we don't remember the flu. And yet many more people, like 3 or 4 times more people died of the flu than died in the First World War. So it was a huge, impactful event in Canadian history, and it's interesting that it's not something that we remember or talk about very often. Until now, of course. The other thing that I find interesting about this story is that it reminds us that Canada is a diverse place, and even in the years of the First World War, it was a diverse country, and that people didn't live those big global events in the same way. It was really dependent on what your community was, where you lived, your age, your gender, your race. Oops. Sorry, she's very creepy, but she's also one of my favorites. Her name is Charlotte. She's fantastic, and she's a ventriloquist figure. And she lives at the Canadian War Museum and scares people all the time. Her maker, Connie Laidlaw, was just a teenager when she began performing troop shows on the home front. She was part of the Victory Entertainers, which is one of hundreds of amateur theater troupes that traveled around the country, raising funds and entertaining military personnel and civilians. I love Charlotte and Connie because it reminds us that people were contributing to the war effort in whatever way they had at their disposal. It also is a really good reminder that you can never judge a book by its cover when it comes to what a war object is. It's just as likely to be a creepy puppet as a uniform. The next section is all about paid work. During both World Wars, the workforce expanded rapidly, and women were able to gain a foothold in the workforce in areas where they hadn't been welcome up until that point. So first of all, with young single women, then married women, and then mothers, and finally, racialized minorities were able to find work in workplaces across the country. We can learn a lot by comparing men's and women's material culture and their experiences. Jock and Nora, who lived in Ottawa until maybe 5 years ago, both of them are gone now, but they both worked together at an aircraft manufacturing plant in Thunder Bay during the war. They both carried their lunchboxes to work. And on the surface, the two lunchboxes tell a fairly similar story. Men and women are across the nation going to work in factories to support their country in wartime. But when we look at the lunchboxes more carefully, we learn that both Jock and Nora had very different experiences at Cancar. One of her friends riveted a nameplate onto the front, and others in her department scrawled their addresses and signatures. It seems like almost the equivalent of a high school yearbook, a souvenir of a fleeting moment in Nora's life. When you look at Jock's lunchbox, it's been repaired a bunch of times, but it's not very fun. There are no signatures, no nameplates, and no autographs. So for Nora, her work was something that she knew was going to be temporary, something that she would not be able to continue forever. Whereas Jock carried his lunchbox to the factory for years before the war and continued to do so for decades after until he retired in the 60s. Another interesting thing about Nora's lunchbox is the fact that she carried one. They had a cafeteria in the plant, and sometimes she said that she would have liked to have bought her food at the cafeteria, but she was uncomfortable crossing this vast factory floor, all the catcalls and the whistles and the yelling. She preferred to carry a lunch and eat at her station because she didn't like to deal with the sexual harassment, which was very common at that point. And the last chapter is worry and loss. So we talked about it earlier that there were lots of new opportunities for women, and also women, well, and men really, often prefer to share their positive experiences and keep their darker moments hidden and private. But I think it's really important to talk about the anxiety and the loss, because it really was the most universal experience of wartime. Above and beyond the massive numbers of war dead, there's the emotional toll of living through a multi-year conflict like that. Even for the women whose husbands and sons came home to Canada, the years of anxiety, financial problems, physical distance, and sometimes trauma left their mark on many families. One such story was the story of Mary Hall, who wore these black-trimmed leather gloves to receive her son's Victoria Cross. He had been killed during a fatal attempt to save a wounded comrade. His story, Frederick William Hall, who was one of the 3 VC recipients who lived on Winnipeg's Pine Street, which is now known as Valor Road, is well known. But for us, the gloves opened up a new and different window into that experience, that family's experience. For us, was not just about him dying and winning the VC. It was about his mother and his siblings who were left behind. So as I mentioned earlier, during and after the wars, women's personal losses were often framed as a noble sacrifice, as a patriotic contribution to the war effort. But as proud as Mary Hall was of her 3 sons who were serving in the military, she was devastated. Following the Victoria Cross Awards ceremony, the Manitoba Free Press reported that even the Victoria Cross could not heal a mother's broken heart. And I think you can see that in her face. And that's 1936, during the Vimy pilgrimage. She was an honored mother. They called them, I can't remember, some murder mothers or something. It's a horrible term. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is this photo album. It belonged to a woman named Michiko Iso, and it's a window into another kind of loss brought about by the Second World War. It's the story of forced relocation and dispossession of Japanese Canadians. The right-hand photo shows Ishi's mother and her 6-year-old brother Kazuo, and it's labeled Evacuation Year 1942, Vancouver. And the photo on the top left is her father and brother with a group of men at a road camp. They had been forced to leave their homes and go and build the houses that would later be used by the families who were removed from Vancouver. There are no other photos in the album from 1942 and 1943. The first, 10 pages of the album are filled with shots of the kids growing up, the kids in cute costumes for school pageants and baby photos in high chairs and things. And then there are these 2 from 1942-43, and that's it. The family camera was gone. So these 2 were taken by professional photographers. All the cars, boats, radios, and cameras were taken. Ishi's father had actually smashed his camera with a hammer because he was so angry at having to have it be confiscated or sold at bargain basement prices. The other thing that gets me about this album is that she's a teenager. She's the one in front with the glasses. So the whole album After that, after 1944, when the camera ban is lifted, there's probably 25 pages of fun shots of her and her friends goofing around, high school majorettes and little skirts. It's just the typical sort of teenage photo album. And she captions all of them, as you can hear her voice as a teenager. This one's called Brr, Isn't It Cold? Her high school class picture is labeled Those Were the Days, and there's numerous cute boys that are tagged with Hubba Hubba. But there's no mention of the barbed wire fence. So the contrast between the captions and her lived reality is what makes this one really powerful to me. So Michiko Iso, who we saw on the previous slide, she gets married eventually and becomes Aikawa. So Michiko Aikawa becomes a noted historian. Late in life, she retires. She's a biologist and a university professor during her career, but then she retires and goes back to school to do a second doctorate in history, and she writes about the history of Japanese Canadians. So for her, as for so many Canadian women, the war continued to have an impact, even many decades later. She wrote amazing work on the first generation of Japanese Canadian women who came over as picture brides, but then also spent quite a bit of time writing about the relocation experience. So it's super interesting to be able to read her words as a teenager, but then also to read how she reflected on those experiences later in life as a senior citizen. There were a number of women who we were lucky enough to be able to find those two perspectives, and that was really interesting. And we also were able, over the course of the project, to interview probably about 25 women or family members to talk to them about their mothers or their aunts or their own experiences. So that was really a fascinating experience, and without those families and these women, we couldn't have written the book. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to you for coming today. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
In this, looking at the screen, it's another example of how the stories connect you so intimately with the women. It must have been an extraordinary experience getting to know them.
It was, and to hear, well, especially the ones I was able to interview, that was really amazing to be able to, you sit in people's living rooms and you get to see the photos of their grandkids and they show you their lives, really. It was a very intimate experience, and I think that was another thing that I thought was so important about the exhibitions, was that for the women to share their experiences and to be validated by being interviewed and having their stuff on display. So many of them, oh, I don't have a story, my husband has the story, or let me talk about my uncle's medals, or that's the story that they think of as being the important one, and yet when they see themselves on display and featured in that way, I think that's important.
When was the exhibition on display?
The main exhibition that we built at the War Museum was on display in 2016 and 2017, and then we've had, there are two different versions that are traveling. One is traveling across Canada. It's been at, 5 or 6 different small museums. And then there's a second version that we redid with the Juno Beach Center. They provided a selection of stories of European women, and they were looking specifically at the Second World War. And we selected, I think, 10 or 12 stories of Canadian women. So that's, I believe, still on display at the Juno Beach Center for anybody who's going to France anytime soon.
Yeah.
Yes, my dear.
What happened to Charlotte and Connie?
That's a good question. Connie moved to Australia. She was hard to track down. It took Stacey a long time to figure out. She got married. Lots of these women got married and their names changed. So it was sometimes very difficult to figure out who they were in their after life. It's one of the challenges of women's history. We made one exception in the book. We wanted named women, and we did include a woman named Mrs. John J. Hamilton, I think. I can't remember her last name, but we don't. John J. Morrison. We never figured out who she was, but that was the only name that we had by. Yes, my dear.
How did the War Museum get Charlotte?
It's a good question. Often what happens is when people start to clean up their houses and they don't know what to do with things, they look around to find a home, the best home. And that was what happened. Charlotte went to go and live, if memory serves, with another member of the Victory Entertainers, the same troupe that Connie was a part of. And then when that woman was cleaning out her house, she donated Charlotte to the War Museum. So at some point, Connie and Charlotte parted ways. Yes?
Where is the quilt?
The quilt is at the Western Development Museum in Saskatoon. Yeah. I have not actually seen it physically. They did an online exhibition a number of years ago where they actually, the staff at the Western Development Museum compiled a list of all of the names, and we tried to figure out who they were. Again, a lot of Mrs. J.R. so-and-sos, so that were hard to track, but there were a number of people who had titles with their names, Mayor so-and-so or Constable so-and-so, and we were able to sort of figure out that who is signing or who is paying to have their name put on there, I guess. Joanna Sinclair was an interesting one. She was a recent immigrant. She'd only arrived in Canada about 2 years before the First World War. She and her adult daughter emigrated, and leaving some adult sons behind. And so she was very intimately connected with Britain because she had just arrived from Britain, really. And in the First World War, that was the case for a huge number of Canadians. They were still, part of the empire. They're busy moving all over the place. And Canada was just one of the destinations. But there's actually a really interesting book somebody just wrote all about the women who traveled from Canada back to Britain to go live with their families while their husbands, who were primarily British, were fighting. And so they would go and live in England, but then of course England fairly quickly runs out of food and wants to send them all back because there are all these women, extra mouths to feed, but they can't get back to Canada because of the shipping, the danger of shipping and things. So they called them the war wives, and it was a big issue. Why are we feeding them when we should be feeding our own, and that kind of thing. Yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering about the story of the socks that the women were knitting. It was really interesting. I never thought that was an important armament in a way to keep the soldier. I mean, if your feet are just freezing and wet. But I was wondering if you ever saw any of these socks, and what were they made of? Were they 2 socks or 2 pieces, or any ideas on that?
Yeah, there are lots actually. It's much more easy to find the socks than it is to find the knitter. So, because a lot of the times the socks would be bundled and sent from the Red Cross or the IODE, and so the men would donate those along with their uniforms, these socks or sweaters or things. I have a picture of a knitting machine, and it's sort of turned on a crank, and a lot of these women's organizations were turning out so many socks that they invested in these auto knitters, they called them. And you'd knit down and then make a stop, and then you'd knit the end and make another stop, and then you'd have to turn the heel by hand. So there was, and in the First World War, it was a little bit, well, Canada was much less centralized, I guess, in the First World War than in the Second World War, and so you can see it in the uniforms. When you go to the War Museum, you can see that the color and the texture of the uniforms from the First World War changes in the rack of jackets because it was so regional, the production. And the same thing with the wool, that individual communities were getting their wool locally, and so the color and the texture changes. But by the Second World War, when that ball of wool that I showed was made, they had army blue or navy blue and army green and Air Force blue. They had standardized sort of fiber, texture, weight, all of that kind of stuff.
It was all wool, though, mostly.
All wool, yeah. And they had, because they did a lot of this sort of centralized knitting, they had, the Red Cross had Mrs. Fix-It. She was one of many Mrs. Fix-Its, but they would basically check to make sure that you weren't sending something subpar out. So, yes.
I would say my mom, like from Lokabet, and that was the St. Anne Society from this area, and that was their job, and to make socks. And I still have the knitting machines. And
Oh,
I
interesting.
got two of them actually now, and I used to make the socks, like I said, tubes that you could sew them or make your own. But the wool became a huge issue because they couldn't get the wool for the Second World War. Then we had a farm, a sheep farm, and there's a lot of sheep farms, and when they used their own wool, they didn't accept the socks. So that all these ladies got so upset they weren't going to do it anymore. And finally, I remember something like you said, the Red Cross came up and explained about the socks. I think they sold the socks and got money, and then they got all this issued wool to make the socks. But I just remember that the socks when I was a little kid. We have the book on, they issued how to make the socks, and it's, you know, an 8-page document. I have that tucked away somewhere, and I'm like you just said, I don't know what I'm going to do with this.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll donate it to somebody in 2 years from now.
There you go. I know you two have to leave. Thank you so much for coming. Enjoy your supper. On the sock front, I had something I was going to say, but I lost it. Sorry. Yes.
Mr. Me? You know, I've always been wondering about this term, war bride. What does that mean?
Well, there were war grooms too, but not as many of them. But it meant that when the men went over to France or Belgium or England, and then they met a woman in the field, and then married and brought her back, they became the war brides. And there's I forget how many thousands of women came over immediately after the war, mostly from England. But and there were some Canadian women who Canada had such a horrible experience in the First World War. Everybody did, really, but they really tried hard at the beginning of the Second World War not to send troops. They wanted to do everything they could to not send men. They wanted to do training, they wanted to produce munitions, they wanted to send trucks, they wanted to do whatever they could but not send troops. So they formed the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan to train all of these pilots from all around the world, and that was going to be their big contribution. Of course, the war kept going and they couldn't stay out for very long, but there were all these pilots from all over the world training in Canada, mostly in the prairies, who met Canadian women. So there were Canadian women who wound up all over Australia and all sorts of places because of that program. So, and a few grooms too, but not as many.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Where's the book available?
And now for my little plug. We have one copy at the library, and then the museum, History Museum and War Museum gift shops carry it. We bought it on Indigo, and then you can also buy it through the University of Ottawa Press, but I'm hoping their website is back up and running, so that one is sometimes less reliable. Yes, Ilsa.
Thank you.
Was there a correlation between the experience that women were having and the suffragette movement?
Oh yeah, in the First World War, there's definitely a tie between the vote and the military nursing sisters actually were the first ones to get the vote in Canada.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it was a political move. Basically, if you were in the war, you obviously supported the war, and therefore you would continue to support the government that was in power. And so in that election, they rolled out the vote for military nursing sisters specifically as a way to keep power politically in Canada. But once the Pandora's box was open, I guess. It was hard to claw it back, and it wasn't long after that women were able to get the vote. And actually, Japanese Canadians and I think the timeline's the same for Chinese Canadians and maybe Black Canadians, I can't remember, but they use their military service as a way of leveraging the ability to get the vote themselves, because those communities didn't have the right to vote. And so after they come back from the First World War, Indigenous soldiers too, they'd served, they'd done what, some of them were killed, they should have been entitled to the same rights, but they came home to either not being able to vote. In the case of Indigenous soldiers, they were kind of marginalized twice over, because a lot of the time their lands were being given away to these returning soldiers as soldier settlement packages, where you're done with your military service, we'll give you some land and now you can farm. But the Indigenous soldiers weren't eligible because they were some of them were under the Indian Act, and so there are communities that really their military service, they used that as a political tool to try and lever rights. So you see a lot of sort of activism and political activism after the First and the Second World Wars.
The second part of my question is, in these exhibitions and in your explorations, did you discover women who were starting to advocate for peace?
Yes, we were actually talking about this, that there were women who advocated for peace, but that it was a much less popular position, and so they tended, A, not to speak up as publicly and leave their writings, and B, not to do it at the War Museum. So they didn't leave those things at the War Museum. So women who were advocating, there are a couple of women who were really involved in sort of international diplomacy efforts during the First World War especially, and they left really amazing bodies of work, but not at the War Museum. Anybody else?
Well, we often hear about the war, of course, and it's the numbers, right? It's always, how many people died and whatnot. And you're so right to think, when you were talking to these women and they were talking about their husband, their uncle, but to bring those stories forward, they are important stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to, when you see these objects and you hear the story behind it, it's not just an object and it's all.
Yeah.
So, no, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
What a beautiful presentation.